take her as payment for the debt. He refused at first, but when he looked at her, everything changed. Before we dive into the story, don't forget to like the video and tell us in the comments where you're watching from.
The sun had already dropped behind the low Nevada hills when Harlan Creed approached Dustwater, the last streaks of daylight fading to a dull blue that stretched across the empty sky. His horse moved at a steady walk, hooves tapping over the hard-packed ground, while Harlan sat upright in the saddle, shoulders stiff from a long ride. He had spent the past week moving freight for a merchant who needed the cargo delivered before a trading deadline, and the job had ended with the merchant's assistant handing Harlan a slip of paper saying a local man would pay the final $5 owed. Harlan didn't like chasing debts, but coin was tight, and he needed supplies before heading out again. Winter wasn't far off, and his cabin, roughly 20 miles north, needed patching before the cold arrived. That was his only mission in town: collect what he was owed and buy enough nails, flour, and lamp oil to last him a month. As he rode past the hitching posts, he tried not to think about the memory of his younger cousin lying still in the dirt years earlier, a memory he didn't choose to revisit, but one that returned whenever he passed through towns with loud saloons and unfamiliar faces. His cousin's death had ended Harlan's years as a wagon guard, leaving him cautious, slower to speak, always checking corners before stepping through them. He dismounted, looped the reins over the post, and took a moment to study the saloon. Lanterns flickered inside, producing uneven light through the dusty windows. The sound of laughter mixed with angry shouts drifted through the door. Harlan didn't hear anything unusual, but the tension in his shoulders stayed, a natural habit earned from too many nights spent in places where a simple misunderstanding turned dangerous. He pushed through the swinging doors. Heat, smoke, and the smell of cheap alcohol filled the room. Men crowded around tables, losing money they didn't have, arguing about cards, slamming mugs, and leaning too close to one another. Harlan stepped aside to let two drunk ranch hands stumble past him, then scanned the saloon slowly, recognizing the younger brother who was supposed to pay him. The younger brother sat hunched over a card game, sweat on his forehead, a small stack of coins shrinking with each losing hand. Harlan walked to the table and stood without speaking until the man finally looked up with a guilty expression. "You have my money?" Harlan asked, keeping his voice steady. The younger brother's face tightened. He shook his head and pointed toward the bar without lifting his eyes. "He's got the coin now," he muttered. "Talk to him." Harlan followed the gesture. The older brother leaned against the bar, posture slouched, a bottle hanging loosely from one hand. His shirt was stained, and his eyes were glassy from drinking too much for too long. Behind him stood a young woman, her hands clasped together, her shoulders shaking subtly from cold or fear. Harlan couldn't tell which yet. He approached the bar with careful steps, stopping far enough away to avoid making the older brother feel challenged, but close enough to speak without raising his voice. "You owe me $5, Harlan said. The older brother blinked slowly, confused by the steady tone. When he finally understood the meaning, he laughed, short, uneven, the kind that came from someone who had stopped caring about consequences. $5, he slurred. "You won't see a single damn coin." Harlan kept his expression even. "I work for it." The older brother reached behind himself and grabbed the young woman by the arm. She stumbled into view, and her condition became clear under the lanterns. Her dress was torn across the chest, the neckline dipping low enough to reveal a deep line between her breasts. A long rip along her ribs exposed bruised skin. Her legs were bare from the knee down, feet dusty and scraped, ankles marked with thin, harsh bruises. Her hair hung in tangled strands over her face. "Take her as payment," the older brother said, forcing her forward. "She'll cover whatever you're after." The woman, Mira, caught herself on the bar, breath unsteady, arms pressed tightly to her chest as she tried to cover the torn fabric. She didn't speak. She didn't argue. She only tried to stand without shaking, as if bracing for someone to decide what happened next. Harlan's first reaction was anger, low, controlled, deep enough that he felt heat rise in his chest. The way the man handled her, reminded him of the broken people he'd seen on the trail after raids. His instinct was to tell the man to release her, but Harlan had learned not to let emotion push him into reckless fights. "I'm not taking a woman for payment," he said. The older brother shrugged and reached for the bottle again. "Then you're walking out empty." Harlan looked at the man, then at Mira. Her eyes remained lowered, but when the older brother shoved her closer, her body tensed as though she thought Harlan might hit her too. That reaction made him pause in a different way. Her fear wasn't loud or wide-eyed. It was quiet and practiced, the kind someone carried after too many nights in dangerous hands. She lifted her gaze slowly. Her eyes were dark, tired, and swollen at the edges, but she didn't look away once they met his. She held her breath, waiting to see what kind of man he was. Harlan felt the weight of that look. He didn't want to take responsibility for someone he didn't know. He didn't want to bring trouble back to his quiet life. But he also couldn't walk out and leave her in a place where people treated her like a bet they'd lost. He reached into his coat and pulled out the few coins he had earned. He placed them on the counter one by one, giving the bartender time to see the transaction clearly. "This settles the debt," Harlan said. "She walks out the door with me." The bartender nodded slightly, tired of the scene. "She should go," he muttered. "This place has taken enough from her." The older brother cursed, but he didn't stop them. He had no strength left to argue. Harlan turned to Mira and lifted his hand slowly, palm open. She hesitated, eyes flickering to the doorway, then placed her trembling fingers into his. Her grip was light, uncertain, but she didn't pull away. Outside, the air was cooler. The street was empty except for a stray dog sniffing at a broken crate. Mira stood beside Harlan, arms pressed tightly over the torn dress to keep herself covered. Her breathing was fast and uneven, the shock of leaving the building showing in the way her shoulders lifted and dropped. "You're safe outside that place," Harlan said quietly. "You don't owe me anything. I paid the debt, so they'd let you walk out." She nodded once, but kept her head lowered. Speaking seemed difficult for her, as if she was afraid her voice would break. Harlan led her to his horse. She winced when she tried to lift her leg, so he placed his hands gently at her waist and helped her up. Her ribs pressed against the saddle horn, and she let out a small sound of pain before she could stop herself. He steadied her again, keeping his hands firm but respectful. "What's your name?" he asked, voice softer than before. "Mira," she whispered, barely audible. Harlan mounted behind her, careful not to touch her more than needed, and guided the horse away from the saloon. The wind brushed through Myra's hair as she leaned forward slightly, holding the saddle horn with both hands to steady herself. They left Dustwater behind, riding toward the dark stretch of open land where the night waited quiet and empty. Mira didn't speak again, and Harlan didn't push her. Their silence settled between them as the road stretched ahead. Two strangers heading toward a place neither had expected to reach together. The night air cooled steadily as Harlan guided the horse north. The lanterns of Dustwater shrinking behind them until they became nothing but scattered specks swallowed by the dark. Mira sat rigid in the saddle, keeping both hands tightly wrapped around the horn, her shoulders lifting faintly every time the horse shifted under her. Harlan watched the edges of the trail, checking the brush for movement out of habit, but he kept part of his attention on her breathing because she sounded like someone trying to stay conscious through pain she didn't want to admit. They rode for nearly 10 minutes without speaking. The road stretched open in front of them, and the wind carried the dry scent of sage. Myra's hair blew across her cheek in uneven strands, and Harlan noticed the tremor along her jaw each time she shivered. He didn't rush to break the silence, but he did slow the horse to a gentler pace so the ride wouldn't jar her ribs further. "Can you hold on a little longer?" he asked quietly. She nodded without turning her head. "Yes," she said, voice strained but steady enough to show she wasn't giving up. Harlan wanted to ask how she'd ended up in that saloon, but he held the question back until they were farther from town. When she shifted slightly, he saw her bare feet dangling over the stirrup and realized she had been standing on that saloon floor without shoes. He slid his trail coat off with one hand and draped it across her legs. She looked down at the weight settling over her lap, surprised, then pulled the coat closer without saying anything. About a mile out of town, he finally spoke again. You were with those men for how long? Mira inhaled slowly before answering. Months, she said. My brother, my real brother, lost me in a card game. After that, the saloon kept me because I had nowhere else to go. Her tone held no drama. She said the words like someone reciting facts they had forced themselves to accept. Harlan's jaw tightened. He hated the idea of someone abandoning their own blood, but he kept his anger quiet because showing it too strongly would only frighten her. Did they hit you tonight? He asked, not to pity her, but to understand what she was dealing with. They grabbed me, she answered. And earlier, one of them pushed me into a wall when I said I needed water. It's nothing new. Harlan shifted slightly in the saddle, and Mira tensed instinctively before realizing he wasn't reaching for her. He adjusted the reins with controlled movements. You're not going back there, he said, not as a promise, but as a statement of fact. She glanced over her shoulder slightly, her eyes catching the faint moonlight. Why did you help me? She asked. You could have walked out. Harlan had already asked himself the same question. He wasn't in town to take on strangers' trouble. He intended to gather supplies and head back to his land where nobody asked for anything. But the way she had looked at him inside that saloon, quiet, exhausted, not begging, not bargaining, had unsettled him in a way he didn't fully understand. You shouldn't have been handed to anyone, he said. I wasn't going to leave you in a place like that. She absorbed the answer with a small nod, her posture easing by a fraction. She didn't press him for more. The trail bent toward a narrow rise, and the sound of running water reached them from a shallow creek that cut across the land. Harlan slowed the horse further and stopped near the edge. We're taking a break, he said. You need water, and the horse does too. Mira tried to dismount on her own, but when she slid her leg over the saddle, her balance faltered. Harlan stepped in quickly, placing one hand near her elbow and the other around her waist so she wouldn't fall. She stiffened, expecting roughness, but his grip stayed controlled and careful. Her breath shook as her bare feet touched the cool dirt. She looked around, scanning the dark brush, her eyes moving like someone who'd spent too long in enclosed rooms and needed time to adjust to wide, open spaces. Harlan handed her his canteen. She drank slowly, pausing after each swallow as if she wasn't used to drinking freely. When she finished, she wiped her mouth with the back of her hand and handed the canteen back without meeting his eyes. Do you have family anywhere? Harlan asked. No, she said. No place that would take me. Not now. Harlan raised his chin slightly, thinking about his own land. It wasn't much, just a small cabin, a corral, and a patch of ground tough enough to grow potatoes in a good year. It wasn't built for company. He hadn't shared it with anyone since the night his cousin died, and the silence of that place had been both comfort and punishment for years. Bringing someone there, especially someone who had been mistreated for so long, would change everything about how he lived. We'll reach my cabin by dawn, he said. It's quiet and far from town. Mira paused. You're taking me there? It's the safest place I have, he answered. You'll get rest and time to figure what you want next. She looked down at her bruised feet, toes curling slightly against the dirt, and a tense breath escaped her. I don't know what I want, she whispered. I haven't had a choice in a long time. Harlan didn't step closer or touch her again. He just nodded once. You'll have one now. The horse snorted softly as it drank from the creek, and the sound settled into the quiet night. Mira watched the water move in small ripples and wrapped Harlan's coat tighter around her chest, the torn dress shifting slightly as she adjusted her grip. The trail behind them stayed empty. No one followed from Dustwater, but Harlan didn't relax fully. He didn't trust people who gambled women away. Men like that often didn't let go of what they thought they owned. He glanced along the ridge, checking for distant silhouettes. Nothing moved except the tips of sagebrush bending in the wind. After a few minutes, he guided Mira back toward the horse. This time, she didn't flinch when he helped her up. She settled into the saddle slower than before, careful not to strain her injuries, and Harlan mounted behind her with the same measured restraint he'd shown since they left the saloon. They rode north again, farther from Dustwater, deeper into the dark land that stretched between the town and his isolated cabin. Myra's breathing grew steadier, though every now and then she inhaled sharply when her ribs protested. Harlan kept his eyes on the trail, but he didn't miss those small reactions, and each one pulled at him with a quiet urgency he hadn't expected to feel for someone he'd met less than an hour ago. As they moved through the empty country, Mira leaned forward, resting her forearms lightly on the saddle horn for support. The wind swept across her face, pushing her hair aside long enough for Harlan to see her expression. She wasn't crying. She wasn't panicking. She looked like someone trying to understand a world she hadn't experienced in years, a world where nobody was yelling at her, grabbing her, or telling her what she was worth. Harlan felt the shift between them. Not trust, not yet, but a small step in that direction. Miles ahead, the faint outline of distant cottonwood trees marked the beginning of the valley where his cabin sat hidden in a shallow basin. The night around them grew quieter, and the road narrowed until it felt like they were leaving the world behind piece by piece. Mira lifted her chin slightly and asked, almost afraid of his answer, "What kind of man are you, Harlan?" He didn't turn his head. He didn't want to startle her with sudden movement. "One who doesn't take what isn't mine," he said. "One who doesn't leave a woman in a place like that." She let out a long, thin breath, as if something inside her loosened for the first time in years. The trail stretched forward, carrying them toward a place she had never seen and he had never planned to share, but neither of them reached for distance. They kept riding, letting the quiet settle, letting the night carry them into the next part of the story neither one had expected to start together. The sky grew darker as they moved deeper into the valley, and the air cooled enough that Mira pulled Harlan's coat up to her collarbone, trying to cover the torn dress without drawing attention to the exposed skin she couldn't hide. Harlan noticed her quiet movements, and without breaking stride, he angled the horse closer to the narrow path between two ridges where the wind was weaker. She didn't thank him aloud, but she lowered her shoulders as the cold eased, and that was enough for him. They rode for nearly an hour with only the sound of hooves on packed soil, and during that time, Myra's breathing steadied again, though every now and then she pressed her hand lightly against her ribs, wincing when her body shifted with the horse's movement. Harlan kept the pace slow for her sake, and though she didn't comment, she watched his hands on the reins like she was trying to understand the kind of man who adjusted his choices for someone he hardly knew. When they reached the base of the valley, the land opened into a wide stretch of grass broken by clusters of cottonwood trees. The faint silhouette of Harlan's cabin came into view, a small shape sitting near a thin stream, distant enough from the trail that a stranger could ride past without ever noticing it. Mira studied the outline, her eyes narrowing as if trying to guess what sort of place she was being taken to, and Harlan expected her to tense again. Instead, she leaned slightly to the side to see better, her curiosity pushing through the exhaustion. "That's your home?" she asked quietly. "Yes," he said. "It's simple, but it's mine." She nodded slowly, absorbing the information. "You live alone?" "For years," he replied. "I didn't plan on that staying true forever. Just happened that way." The answer made her look forward again, thinking about the unanswered questions she'd carried from the saloon. She had wondered who he really was, what kind of life he led, and whether he brought her here because he had some hidden motive or because he truly meant to give her space to breathe. The cabin helped answer some of that. It wasn't large enough for someone running schemes, and it wasn't built like a place where a man entertained company. It looked like a life he kept at arm's length from everyone. As they got closer, Mira shifted slightly. If someone comes looking for me," she asked carefully, "will they find this place?" "They shouldn't," Harlan said. "Only a few people know it exists. And the men from Dustwater rarely ride past the ridge, too far from whiskey and gambling tables." She let out a breath she had been holding since they left town. When the horse finally stopped near the small corral beside the cabin, Harlan dismounted first. He moved slowly, aware she hadn't been on a long ride in a long time, and held a steady hand to help her down. Her feet touched the cool dirt, and she staggered slightly before regaining her balance with a soft sound between pain and relief. Harlan watched carefully, noting how she tried to conceal discomfort by tightening her jaw. He nodded toward the porch.